Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. First, I'll start with an apology. I do not speak Thai, so I'll have to deliver the presentation in English. And thank you for MTech for arranging such a beautiful event here today. What I'm going to speak to is what I refer to as the evil twin, or the evil twins, really, when phishing turns into ransomware and how that kind of like comes about. So Proofpoint publishes the State of the Fish report every year, and we just issued one at the end of 2021. And what we've seen is clearly that the attackers are becoming more and more active. From the companies that we've surveyed, that we asked for details, and they were kind enough to provide us with some information, we've seen an increase in the amount of phishing, an increase in the amount of BEC, or business email compromise. These are the emails that contain, in most cases, no malicious content. There's no link, there's no attachment, really, and it's more so an attempt to maybe impersonate someone to get some action taken, money being transferred, information being shared, and so on. We then also saw an increase with the volume of the spear phishing or whaling. These are the more personalized attack, highly targeted against high-value individuals in a lot of cases. But in other cases, we've seen that the attackers realize that us, the security professionals, are putting so much focus on the VIPs that they started to divert and try to attack people, let's say, at the second tier or the third tier, where they realize that these people have some authority or some ability to get information or to move money around. So out of those companies, 83% of them actually said that they've experienced a successful email-based phishing attack. This is up 57% over the report that we had from 2020. 54% of them handled more than 3 successful such attacks over that year, and 11% of those companies actually mentioned over 10 such successful attacks. These are staggering statistics when you think about it, and it always comes back to the fact that when we look into different security controls, it's sometimes not a question of if, but a question of when something will happen. And one of the reasons is that the attackers are kind of like moved on from looking at the network perimeter security. The moat around our people that we try to constantly build does not actually stick with the way that the attackers look at it. So the attackers are actually targeting people rather than targeting systems. They will go into systems such as LinkedIn, Facebook, and other social networks and other information sources to try and figure out how to actually hit a specific person. You can see examples of a new employee starting at a company, publishing something on the likes of LinkedIn that they've just started with a new company, and within a week you will see an email trying to attack the payroll department, impersonating this person, trying to tell them that he or she changed their bank account details. So this is kind of like a payroll fraud attempt. So it's not always a technical attempt to cripple the company, but more of a financial benefit. So these tools are available out there for the attackers to use, whether it's Hunter, LinkedIn, different paste bin locations and whatnot, to get some information about the individuals and try to attack the individuals or the individuals' managers and superiors to try and see what can happen. Now, there are really 2 main kind of like types of phishing that we look at. While we have the bulk phishing, that is just like a spray campaign that we send a lot of emails and try to get someone to fall for it. It's not personalized. We look at spear phishing as the more sophisticated, elaborate version of phishing. It's targeted, it's personalized. The lure itself will be more compelling and more realistic. This means that the attackers were learning and attempting to understand how your users are actually going to fall for something. This is kind of like the same way when you run a phishing simulation, you are trying to make this as realistic or as difficult as possible for your end users to actually identify such a situation. Now, the purpose of getting all of those is usually either to get the user to click on something, which eventually, let's say, deploys ransomware. It may be URLs that will just kind of like be a credential harvesting attempt, or even hidden forms, or a drive-by download that will actually be some sort of a silent remote access Trojan, and so on. The other side of it is the business email compromise. The problem is an attempt to actually assume someone else's identity. It is not always the CEO fraud. It is not always the CFO fraud. It will not always be the case that someone just sends an email with the name of the CEO asking someone to transfer money. In 2 or 3 years ago, the attempts usually were actually like that, very simplistic. They would send an email in claiming to be, let's say, the chief financial officer. And in that one email, they would actually even expose the bank account that they want the SWIFT transfer to go to. Once they realize that actually each and every time they get caught, they lose access to these bank accounts, the attacks became more sophisticated. They want emails to be exchanged, they want trust to be established, and only then they will expose that very expensive resource, which are those mule accounts that they need to use. Okay? Now, the target here and the purpose in most cases is wire transfer. But we had seen situations where they were actually requesting information to maybe attack the individuals personally at a later point in time. So when emails come into an environment, one of the issues that we have is that in the past, we had the ability to look at where the email came from. It's an unusual domain, or the links were stuff like, I don't know, Bitly, or some domains in countries that we don't usually do business in. The problem that we have now is that in most cases, the attackers are exploiting legitimate services. You will most likely get a successful attack when one of your business partners, one of your suppliers, is actually the one that initially got compromised. The emails will be sent from a legitimate account that you actually expect to see emails coming from, and the links will most likely be on that company's SharePoint, where they will host the first stage of the attack to get the users to actually fall for it. So what that leaves us with is we can't trust anyone outside of our own environment. So when you think about when you manage your email gateway, your SAG, setting a safe list because you work with some company puts you potentially at danger, because you are, by the virtue of creating that safe list entry, you are trusting them completely, okay? Or partially, depending on how the gateway operates. Now, we've seen these amount of messages that came through. The Microsoft brand is constantly being used to try and phish users, and we've seen actually that Amazon was not, it's kind of like we went from that retail style. In prior years, what we've seen when we filter emails for all of our clients is that we scan the URLs, we sandbox URLs that go through the system. And at some point in time, it kind of like tipped from all of those URLs that you can, as a human, look at and say, oh, it must be bad, that's easy, to get to the point that now all of the URLs are actually, or I would say 54% of them, are actually hosted on Microsoft. So think about it. 54% of the bad URLs that we filtered for our clients were hosted on either SharePoint, OneDrive, or Office Forms. Now, the other thing that happens, all of the others, the other 46%, is also utilizing legitimate services, whether it's Dropbox, whether it's Canva, whether it's Google Docs. And one of the things that you realize is that you cannot just decide, oh, let's block that domain. You can't block SharePoint.com. You cannot block Google.com. So the issue here is that each and every URL that passes through a system that goes into the environment with your users potentially clicking on, you should consider the fact that your users need to be trained to better understand what they actually receive, but you want to make sure that your filtering system is capable of looking at the full URL, the end location, and actually filtering the specific content within to actually make the decision on whether it's bad or not. You cannot rely solely on the domain or the IP reputation of that location. So why does this keep happening? One of the things that we've identified is through Verizon DBIR, the data breach report that they issue every year, 97% of the breaches will start with an attack targeting people, either a human error or insiders within the business that will cause this. So there is a disparity when we think about, in general or on average, how the security spending of the budget that each company has is actually split. If 97% of the breaches relate to the human element, how come we're spending over 74% of our budgets constantly on endpoints and on the network, while our users are not sitting inside the network anymore, and potentially they're not even using an endpoint that we're the ones issuing to them, because everyone works from anywhere and connecting using their own personal phones and so on. So, in a way, with ransomware, actually about 70% of the organizations that we expect had some infection happening, while it was in most cases isolated, but we looked at it and it was an amazing thing to understand. What they've done afterwards in order to deal with it was a bit staggering to actually think that 58% of companies that got affected by ransomware actually decided to pay at least once, because they believe that they will actually get their content back at that point, which was not always the case, as you can see from the statistics that we share here. The top method of delivery of ransomware is one thing that we need to understand is, while we say that email is actually the main method of delivery, and it is the case, the ransomware itself is not delivered in that first email that comes through. Even if the email will contain a bad attachment in it, that attachment is not actually the ransomware. So if we look back at 2016 or 2017, we had mass campaigns of stuff along the lines of Locky that actually contained the piece of malware, the ransomware inside the email. That was fairly easy to catch because all you had to do is sandbox the attachments, figure out that they're about to encrypt something on the disk, empty your recycle bin and so on to make sure you have no way of recovering in any other way. But what we do now actually, or what the attackers do, is the ransomware is delivered actually as a second stage of the attack. So the attack starts with an email that will have a first stage payload. That will be a downloader, stuff along the lines of Emotet or Baziloader or something along these lines. It will be a very thin downloader that will grab some information from the device and eventually get to the point of exploiting, only then actually taking that installation and lastly taking the action of whether they will actually encrypt the disks or maybe install a remote access Trojan or anything else along those lines. So when you look at the slide just behind me, so it will start with an email that will contain an attachment. The user will click on it. Potentially, we will have the macros come through, and then later on that happens. So if I quickly go through this, so a Word document is being sent, attempted at, let's say, 3 different employees. Out of those 3 employees, let's say it passed whatever the filtering system is. At that point, let's say the server admin will not click on it, HR does click on it, VP marketing will click on it. We then get to the point that these documents are actually calling back to the internet to actually call for that installer to come. So that is essentially through an OLE object, a macro, VB, and so on. Baziloader gets installed, and then grabs some information out of the devices, sends that information back to the attacker, the threat actor, which in turn will sleep on it and later on make the decision to actually provide Cobalt Strike onto those machines. So what we see here is that Cobalt Strike was not actually delivered in the initial phase through mail. It will actually happen at the second phase of these attacks. And of course, through Cobalt Strike, lateral movement will be possible, and they can potentially get to the server admin at a later point in time. Okay? And that will end up with a ransomware onto the actual high-value systems. So stopping ransomware from our point of view is making sure that we actually stop the first stage malware. That will be the trick or TrickBot, Bazel Loader, Sokolish, IcedID, QBot, Emotet, and so on. And that will eventually, those end up with these ransomware. So the way that we want to look at this is to go from a view of the network to look back into a people-centric defense mode. So what we try to understand here is how people get attacked, what is their level of privilege to be able to actually ascertain what is the potential damage, and then their vulnerability, which can be based on past clicks. They fell for stuff that happened, or they never finished their security awareness training, or they fall for a phishing simulation, or their credentials were found somewhere out there because we were able to assert through threat intelligence that that is happening. So we look at, essentially by attack, privilege, and vulnerability, we look at the probability of something happening, what would be the impact had something happened, and what is the likelihood for something to happen. So all of this information is then gathered onto a platform, and it will allow us to then come back with the information of who are the imminent targets, the most attacked people, or the very attacked people that are very vulnerable, as well as very privileged. And the privilege will be ascertained not just as a technical privilege, not just who's the global admin on the system, but a person who's in accounts payable, for example, that is a level of privilege because they can move money. Okay? So with that, what I want to leave you just a little bit of an overview of Proofpoint. So we look at kind of like 3 different platforms to deal with this situation. That is the threat protection that we've talked about today, information protection to protect the data itself, not just the people, and then access and compliance for archiving. And with that, I would like to thank you. And
ขอบคุณครับ A big round of applause, please. Kindly remain on the stage, Mr. Omer Lahaft. Up next, we have Kun Glitsana, who will be doing the honor of summing up the topics of the evil twins, phishing, and ransomware, a little bit in Thai, and also will present a token of appreciation to us, you as well.
Thank you very much. Let me have a short summary for
Thank you.
Okay. ค่ะก็คือในส่วนของ Proofpoint นะคะจริงๆแล้วใครพอจะทราบนะบอกว่าความจริงแล้วเขาจะมีว่าสาเหตุที่ทำให้เกิด Data Breach ขึ้นมามันมีจำนวนเยอะมากเลยค่ะบอกใบ้เลยกันนะคะว่ามากกว่า 90% ไม่ทราบว่าใครในนี้พอจำได้ไหมครับว่ากี่เปอร์เซ็นต์ที่เป็นลักษณะของว่าเป็นสาเหตุที่ให้เกิด Data Breach ในองค์กรของเรายกมือด้วยค่ะเดี๋ยวเรามีของรางวัลกระตุ้นเศรษฐกิจนิดนึงค่ะเวกอัพหน่อย90เท่าไหร่คะ97ค่ะถูกต้องค่ะขอให้น้องไปรับมอบของรางวัลที่โต๊ะได้เลยขอบคุณนะคะก็คือจริงๆแล้วในส่วนของในฝั่งของ Proofpoint เองนะคะสาเหตุที่ในส่วนของแต่ละหน่วยงานเองเขาบอกว่าวิเคราะห์มาว่าในฝั่งของ Data Breach เนี่ยเกิด 97% เนี่ยเกิดจากในส่วนของ people นะคะเกิดจากในฝั่งของมนุษย์ของเราเนี่ยก็คือคนพวก user ต่างๆนะคะถ้าเกิดมองพอนั่งฟังเสร็จปุ๊บเนี่ยทำให้เรา mapping อะไรบางอย่างได้นะคะเนื่องจากว่าทุกองค์กรจะต้องใช้อีเมลนะคะก็คือส่วนใหญ่ที่มาก็คือจะเป็นในเรื่องของ IT Manager Safety Manager Safety Director ต่างๆนะคะก็คือถามว่าเราไม่สามารถจะไปเฝ้าระวัง User ทั้งหมดทุกคนได้นะคะเปรียบเสมือนตอนนี้เราก็มีลูกๆหลานๆนะคะไปโรงเรียนซึ่งเขาเองเขาก็ไม่รู้ว่าอันไหนที่ปลอดภัยไม่ปลอดภัยเขาที่ไปจับต้องโน่นเอามือเข้าตาขยี้ตาขยี้จมูกอะไรเงี้ยอันนั้นก็เหมือนกันกับในการที่ว่า User พอเปิดอีเมลขึ้นมาเนี่ยเขาก็ไม่รู้หรอกว่าไฟล์ไหนควรจะดาวน์โหลดไฟล์ไหนไม่ควรดาวน์โหลดหรือลิงก์ไหนควรจะไปลิงก์ไหนไม่ควรจะไปเขาก็เปิดไปบางทีมีอะไรมีแถมมีโบรชัวร์มีวอเชอร์อะไรก็มาเขาก็คลิกไปโดยที่ไม่รู้นะคะในส่วนของ Proofpoint เองก็คือจะเป็นในเรื่องของ Email City มาช่วย Protect ในฝั่งของเมสเสจต่างๆที่เข้ามาหาในฝั่งของ User นะคะนอกเหนือจากนั้นเขาก็มีเป็นลักษณะของ Machine Learning หรือลิงก์ที่เปิดไปถ้าเกิดไม่แน่ใจเขาจะมีในฝั่งของ Isolate Web ออกไปให้นะคะนอกเหนือจากนั้นมันก็จะมีในส่วนของตัว Threat Management ในเรื่องของการทำ Analytics ว่าเนี่ยข้างนอกนั้นมันมี Threat อะไรบ้างในส่วนของตรงนี้กำลังเข้ามาถึงในฝั่งของอีเมลระบบอีเมลของคุณนะคะถ้าเกิดอยากได้รายละเอียดก็จะเป็นในส่วนของ Proofpoint นะคะก็ในทาง MTech ขอบคุณ Proofpoint มากๆเลยค่ะ Thank you very much
Thank you